Let's begin with the refuge prayer.
Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness.
Mostly, we are not aware of the world that we create and experience around ourselves. And we generally take our sense of fixed realities as a given. So even when we contemplate something like preciousness of a human birth, we can pretty much automatically, without even noticing that we're doing it, take for granted that we have this life, and that, yeah, it's okay, precious, and we might just leave it there. So there's a reason why we really want to leverage this opportunity by encouraging ourselves to intentionally get involved with our experience of the phenomena around us. Intentionally get involved in the way in which we continuously manufacture that experience, generally without noticing. So one of the methods which can feel kind of humorous at one level, nonetheless can be quite potent. when engaged in with a certain sense of exploration of the vast capabilities of our own minds. If we ask what are the odds of being born as a human, we might think that it's small, but not incredibly small. But if we look at the vast array of beings, sentient beings, that is, a being with a mind, including insects, fish, and birds, if we contemplate that for a while, it can seem like the odds are overwhelming that we would not be born human. And it's not just a matter of noting that the odds are against next time being a human. It's helpful to us to acknowledge the improbable rebirth as a human being. So that once again we can appreciate what we have. Someone once said to me, "You mean no more crybabies?" I thought that was pretty good. We can cry, we should do so on behalf of others. To have a sense of appreciation is to have a sense of joy. To have a sense of the responsibility that goes with that appreciation, which is part of the practice of the four immeasurables. We can feel a sense of responsibility that arises out of the appreciation. And gradually then, if you work on these, you can see, oh, I see where these go. These are not the absolute truth. These are all the relative truths that become our lighthouse, our beacon, that can give us a sense of connection with others and joyful responsibility rather than just continuous hardships on behalf of a spiritual tradition. This is not a martyr's tradition. This is a tradition of joyfully encouraging ourselves to rise to our own capabilities, master them. So little by little, as we go through these, perhaps we elaborate a little and have a sense of more connection. Oh, I can do this, I can work with this. These are the things that when we do Chenrezig are so important, to go through these four immeasurables and really have a sense of why you would practice Chenrezig, not just because it happens to be the practice of the day or the week. So again then, take a little time, and we will take a little time with the four thoughts, especially with precious human existence and impermanence. And then we'll begin the third and fourth ones. Now we come to the third ordinary foundation, which is called the truth of karma, cause and effect. And as many of you know, this is primarily associated with an ability and a sense of morality and skillful means. One of the issues that we learn early on is that karma, sense of interconnectedness between all things and our intentions, our actions, and so on, how they all kind of fit together. We're also warned that unless we are fully awakened, fully enlightened, we cannot fully understand the mechanism of karma. Nonetheless, in order for our path to progress, in order for us to be able to engage in the practices fruitfully, we have to be free of obstacles to a certain extent. And commonly, the obstacles are, let's say, the biggest antidote to the obstacles that we encounter along the way is the good fortune of encountering and having a connection with a spiritual friend who can give teachings and guide us along the way. That leads us to the place where we gain an understanding on our path, and also holding the benefit of others as primary above our own benefit. We learn what things we might take up and work with and do, and what are better left alone or not practiced. So, of course, one of our primary focuses is to engage in those things which might bring about a fortunate rebirth in the future again. In addition to that, recognizing the nature of having a fortunate human rebirth, there is a natural sense also that we would like to do something positive. Since our future is determined largely by the things that we do and don't do, in other words, by our karmic proclivities and the fruit of those karmic proclivities, we naturally want to do the things that lead to the best results. And as our ability to make those choices improves, so too our path bears more fruit. So in our contemplations, we think about the things that we currently do, which are not so good. And then also those things which seem to be helpful for ourselves and for others, and engaging in the practices and contemplations more and more, these things become more and more clear. Now the challenge here is really, how do you make each of these foundations, and we haven't done the fourth one yet, but so far the first three, how do we make them relate to them in such a way that they become part of our thinking, part of our speech, part of our experience, all day, every day, and all night too. And while that's difficult, the path to that is simply what we always have done. If we look at the things that we have always done and said, thought about, we can see by looking at those things to a great degree why we are where we are, by virtue of what we have done, what we have thought, what we have said over and over and over. So the Dharma really is about change. How do you change, and how do you change intentionally? And so that's a large piece of what we're looking at today. A moral decision, if we could use that word somewhat lightly, a moral decision is a decision which comes about intentionally and with knowledge as to what the outcome is likely to be in favor of both ourselves and others, that we might continue fruitfully along the path in ever-expanding ways to benefit others. So take a moment and contemplate that one. 5 minutes. Now as we come to the fourth of the four thoughts, the fourth one is what we commonly call the faults of samsara. And we often speak of samsara as if it has an address somewhere in space and time. And often we will reference samsara as basically wherever we are. And the reason for that, if there can be a reason, is that we carry that suffering with us all the time. So the primary characteristic of the faults of samsara is suffering. And that suffering takes on a number of different characteristics or kinds of suffering, if you will. The first suffering in samsara is what we call the suffering of suffering, which is actually easy to understand as essentially physical and emotional pain. So if we have a toothache, that's the suffering of suffering. And if we add to that we have an aversion to the toothache, it's still the suffering of suffering. It's the most immediate kind of suffering that we all relate to and all understand. In this world, the suffering of suffering is the suffering that everyone is familiar with. Everyone sees it, everyone experiences it. And so it is something common for us. It's a binding factor. So we can take a few moments and just contemplate that suffering of suffering as something which can be distinguished, at least slightly, from the other kinds of things that we might call suffering. See if you can find those. Now to go slightly deeper into the suffering of suffering, recognizing the suffering of suffering as a kind of reaction to what is unpleasant. That is to say, the suffering of suffering is not just a cute way of relating to an experience, emotional or physical. It also provides us with a means by which we can do something positive. So, for example, I say this just as my own personal practice relating to the fact that I've had a few painful visits to the dentist in the not too distant past. And of course, the suffering of suffering is waiting. And when I get there, I first have some suffering because I have some aversion already building towards the experience which I expect to have. Whether or not it manifests is irrelevant. I will have it again for the next visit. But when I go in to see the dentist, I also understand that from one dentist who said to me that no one has ever said that they appreciate coming and seeing the dentist. And so it's an opportunity to express appreciation for something which, while a cause of some trepidation, nonetheless has high probability of improving your situation. And so to say that you appreciate that to someone who never gets appreciated, they immediately feel a sense of kindness and a sense of joy in it. And so in the moment of their feeling that joy, our suffering of suffering also is diminished, if not completely eradicated. So we can use these various things by virtue of contemplating them and working with them in real situations with others especially, to reduce our discomfort and increase our joy in relationship to our connections with others, which is where we expect to have and most want a joyful connection. So let's take a few minutes on this one. take a little break in place. Now, regarding the suffering of samsara, we covered the suffering of suffering, the most common and obvious form of suffering, which is just the experience of physical and emotional, mental pain. And following that is the suffering of change. The suffering of change can be described in a number of ways, but essentially we're really meant to see here that change itself is suffering. Not that it's likely that changes would occur that I don't like, even though that is likely, but rather that even when changes occur that I would prefer to have occurred, there is a subtle, at least, undercurrent of suffering that goes with it. So this you can test on your own by just sitting quietly and looking at your own responses, your own contemplation, which in one moment feels utterly stable, and the next moment you realize retroactively that something that was there has now been gone, and so you're continuously confronted with this sense of change that doesn't occur periodically, but is more continuous than we might imagine. So that's a good one to work with. And just to close the loop here, there is a third suffering in samsara, which has a kind of glorious title called the suffering of cyclic existence. And there we're talking about rather profound things that add up to just the fact that cyclic existence itself, that is to say, the cycle of things in general, as well as our birth and living and suffering and dying and rebirth and so on, in addition to all the ordinary kinds of changes that occur, that when we look at it closely, there is an enormous amount of suffering that occurs from the subtle to the most gross ways, and we can put them into these categories and think about them in that way. But in truth, I think the best way to approach it is you sit down, you engage in your meditation. In the process of engaging in your meditation, you find that in one moment you feel a sense of joy. And in the next moment or a little later, you feel a sense of distress or a sense of physical and mental discomfort. And then the mental discomfort disappears and something else comes. So there's this continuous flow of experience, which is really what's meant to be there in the contemplation, a continuous flow of experience that we continuously, by virtue of training, recognize as it comes and goes. When we recognize it as it is, the suffering is pretty much not important. It's when we don't recognize it, we have the experience, it's an experience we didn't want, and therefore we would like to get rid of it. Now we're in the place of generating more discontent and suffering for ourselves. So these practices are normally done in a kind of quick way by virtue of reciting a liturgy that contains the faults of samsara, the impermanence, the precious human birth, and the levels of suffering, but we don't necessarily embrace those in a way that integrates those experiences with the practice that we're engaged in. And so occasionally my advice from my own experience is it's good to take some time and go into those 4 practices and work with them individually for some period of time until we actually have the experience of them one by one. So if you want to take a little bit more time with it, we could take 5 or 10 minutes now before we break for lunch.
this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state. Good idea. Only one?
Well, we'll have more. Don't worry. So we are going to have a potluck lunch today. Suffering of change. Nothing's really been planned. So we weren't sure. We were hoping to be set up from the celebration yesterday, but that didn't happen. And we weren't sure what the temperature was going to be like, whether we were going to be inside or outside. So I know what a cooperative Sangha you are and how generous you are. And so, so I'm hoping we can all work together to meet out under the tent. I think it'd be nice to be out there today. So people have put their cold dishes down in the refrigerator, so those need to be carried out. I did pull out the utensils that we had over at Monroe, so in case you've forgotten your utensils, we'll have some of